The phone rang just after 8 on a Wednesday evening. I had been setting a pot of chamomile to steep the kind of quiet ritual that makes the house feel less empty. The name glowing on the screen was Sabine's, not Adrian's. My son almost never called anymore, and when he did, it was hurried, sandwiched between meetings, or softened by his wife's presence. I answered. Bonsoir, Sylvie. Sabine began drawing out the French greeting as though it were a private joke. I wanted to let you know about Friday. My parents have just arrived from Provence. We're hosting a very intimate dinner. Of course we expect you. Her voice held that polished edge she used whenever she wanted something dressed as courtesy. I listened, saying nothing at first, until she prompted, "Are you there?" "Yes," I replied. "Friday, 7:30 sharp, at our house in Lake Oswego. It will be formal. My parents are very traditional. You understand, appearances matter to them. I know you'll do your best. Not an invitation, a summons." I let the words rest in the silence between us. "And Adrian?" I asked finally. "Oh, he's swamped with work. He asked me to call on his behalf. You know how he forgets small details when he's stressed." I almost laughed. Adrian might forget birthdays or appointments, but he never forgot to call me himself unless someone convinced him it wasn't necessary. "Of course," I said. "I'll be there." Perfect." Sabine answered, her smile audible through the line. "It will mean a great deal to my parents. They've been wanting to meet you properly. As if the wedding where they arrived late and left early hadn't counted. When the call ended, I set the phone on the counter and poured my tea. The liquid had steeped too long. It tasted bitter. I sipped anyway, staring out at the maple tree I had planted the year Adrian turned 12. The branches had grown thick and protective, but the leaves were already thinning for autumn. I wondered what kind of dinner this would be. Not a gathering to honor family, that much was clear. Sabine's tone carried more performance than warmth. I knew the Morels by reputation, elegant, exacting, fluent in the art of quiet dismissal. She had once bragged that her mother could dismantle a person's confidence with a single raised brow. I turned off the kitchen light and let the house fall into shadow. The old floors creaked as I walked to the living room. On the mantel, a photograph of Adrian at 6 years old smiled back at me, cheeks smudged with dirt from the baseball field eyes, wide and unguarded. I touched the frame lightly. Whatever waited for me at that table, I would endure it for him. He was still my son, still the child I had once read stories to in both English and French long before Sabine entered his life. I carried the bitter tea upstairs and set it on the nightstand, knowing I would not sleep easily. The phone call still echoed, not in sound but in weight. And in the dark, I thought about how some invitations arrive already sharpened like knives, and how silence often hides the sharper blade. By morning, I would remember why I had hidden so much of my past, and why the time was coming when hiding would no longer serve. The morning after Sabine's call, I rose early, though I had hardly slept. The kitchen smelled of coffee, and faintly of last night's over-steeped chamomile, a bitterness clinging to the air. I ground the beans slowly, letting the rhythm steady me. My mind wandered backward, as it often did when I felt cornered back to the years no one in this city seemed to know had ever belonged to me. I was 23 the first time I set foot in Paris. My French then was clumsy, stitched together from university courses and cassette tapes. By the time I left 5 years later, it flowed from my tongue with the ease of water. I had not gone as a tourist, but as a young wife following a husband whose work in architecture promised adventure. It gave me more than that, a city that taught me to stand tall, a language that could cut or charm, depending on how you wielded it. While he designed facades, I built something quieter, but just as real, a small consulting office helping American companies find footholds in Europe. It started with translating documents and negotiating contracts, but soon I was flying between Bordeaux and Lyon, speaking for men who underestimated me until they learned I could dismantle an entire deal clause by clause. I loved it, the sense of independence, the elegance of contracts written in two tongues. When Adrian was born, I imagined raising him bilingual, letting him chase pigeons in the Luxembourg gardens, teaching him that the world was larger than a single neighborhood. For a while it seemed possible. Then life shifted. My husband fell ill, his lungs weakened by years of careless habits and Parisian smog. We came home to Oregon for treatment, expecting a short stay. He never returned. I closed the office, sold my share to a colleague, and poured everything into holding our small family together. Adrian was only 8. He needed stability more than stories about boardrooms in Bordeaux. I told myself that burying the past was a way of protecting him, though sometimes I wondered if I had also buried pieces of myself. Adrian grew bright and ambitious. He went to college, found work, married Sabine. And I never told him how fluent his mother truly was, in the language his wife liked to scatter through conversation like pearls only she could afford. To him, I was simply mom, dependable, and ordinary. The Paris years became my secret, folded away like letters in a drawer. Now, standing in my Portland kitchen decades later, I understood the irony. They believed I couldn't understand them. Sabine and her parents spoke freely in French at dinners and gatherings, assuming I caught nothing beyond a word or two. Adrian never questioned it, and I let it stand not out of weakness, but out of habit. Silence becomes comfortable when you practice it long enough. Yet Sabine's phone call had stirred something I had left dormant. Her tone, so careful, so commanding, reminded me of men in those Parisian offices who thought a young woman could be talked over. I had spent years proving them wrong. Perhaps I would again. I carried my coffee to the table and pulled out an old notebook from the drawer. Its pages smelled faintly of dust and ink, the kind of scent memory loves. I wrote a single line in French, as if testing whether my hand still remembered "Il ne faut jamais sous-estimer une femme silencieuse." You should never underestimate a silent woman. The words looked steady on the page, and I felt steadier for having written them. I closed the notebook, slid it back into the drawer, and looked out at the maple tree outside the window. Its branches reached higher than the roofline now, and I thought of the Friday dinner waiting for me. The past, I had hidden so carefully, was no longer a weight, it was becoming a weapon. And for the first time in years, I was ready to lift it. Friday arrived with skies the color of pewter, and the kind of still air that makes you feel as though something is waiting. I took more care dressing than usual, choosing a navy dress that fell cleanly to my knees, pearls my husband had once given me, and a silk scarf tucked neatly at the collar. Formal enough, without apology. Driving through Lake Oswego's quiet streets, I noticed how each house seemed to compete with the next manicured lawns, iron gates, windows lit with curated warmth. The Morels would feel at home here. I parked at the curb outside Adrian and Sabine's place, a cream-colored home with symmetrical hedges. My reflection in the glass door looked composed, though inside my stomach coiled tight. The door swung open before I rang the bell. Mother Adrian said with his familiar smile, pulling me into a quick hug. He looked sharp in a gray suit, his hair brushed with more care than usual. "You look wonderful." "Thank you, darling," I replied, letting myself hold his shoulder a moment longer. Inside the house gleamed. Polished wood floors, silver candlesticks on the console, everything arranged as if for a magazine spread. Sabine approached from the dining room, her parents just behind. "Ah, Sylvie," she said smoothly, her French lilt sharper tonight. "You've arrived. May I present my parents Etienne and Colette Morel?" Etienne extended a hand. Tall, silver hair brushed back his smile, carried the grace of someone who had practiced it in mirrors. "Enchantée, madame," he said. Colette's eyes flicked from my scarf to my shoes before she smiled. "So lovely to meet properly," she added, her accent curling each word. We exchanged pleasantries in English, Adrian glowing at the formality of it all, proud to see his family blending with theirs. He didn't notice the faint tightness in Colette's lips, or the way Etienne's gaze lingered half a beat too long on my dress. We moved into the living room, where crystal glasses already waited on a polished tray. Sabine poured Bordeaux with a flourish, glancing at her father for approval. I lifted my glass, inhaling the familiar notes, and took a careful sip. Excellent, of course, Bordeaux almost always was. Etienne arched a brow, surprised, perhaps, that I noticed. We sat, conversation flowing politely in English, at first weather flight's impressions of Portland. Then, like a shift in current, their voices dipped into French, quiet words pitched just low enough for them to believe they were private. "She looks provincial," Colette murmured, eyes still fixed on her glass. Etienne chuckled. "Comme une femme de campagne. Old-fashioned." Sabine's lips curved into that small smirk I had seen many times, the one Adrien always mistook for charm. "Elle fait de son mieux," she said lightly. "She's doing her best." The laughter was soft, restrained, but it slid like a blade across the table. I kept my expression neutral, sipping my wine, watching Adrien beam at his wife's parents, as though he had won some prize. He didn't hear the words. He never did. They went on their French smooth as silk, mocking my scarf, my age, even the way I sat. "Elle n'appartient pas ici." She doesn't belong here. The words landed, but I let them pass over me, catalogued in silence. My years in Paris had taught me many things: how to negotiate a contract, how to read a room, and how to turn silence into armor. Adrien lifted his glass. "To family," he said proudly, oblivious to the fractures forming just beneath the polished surface. Sabine's parents raised theirs with polite smiles. I touched the rim of mine gently, though my heart thudded with a different kind of toast. The meal was called in. We moved toward the dining room where silver and crystal gleamed beneath the chandelier. I followed my face, serene, my notebook already forming in my mind. Each word they spoke in French would be remembered, each slight inked as carefully as any business contract. I smoothed the scarf at my collar and took my seat, Adrien glowing with the joy of hosting, unaware that his wife's parents had already tried to reduce me to dust. I kept my silence, letting them believe it was defeat. They did not know that silence was only the first step. When I came home that night, the house greeted me with its familiar quiet. I slipped off my shoes by the door, set my scarf on the arm of the chair, and stood still a moment, letting the silence wash away the hum of Sabine's polished dining room. The taste of Bordeaux still lingered on my tongue, though it was no longer wine, but ash. I went to the desk in my study, the one I rarely used now except for bills or birthday cards. I opened the drawer and pulled out a fresh notebook, its spine stiff with disuse. For a long moment, I simply looked at the blank page. The temptation was to close it, to let the evening drift into memory, as I had done so many times before. But something in me resisted. I uncapped a pen and began to write. First in English, then again in French, each insult recorded with precision. Provincial, old-fashioned. Elle n'appartient pas ici. She doesn't belong here. I pressed harder than I intended, the ink leaving ridges on the paper. It felt less like note-taking than bookkeeping. Each line a debit entered against my dignity. And as I wrote, the bitterness that had sat heavy in my chest began to shift, to take form. Balance comes later, I told myself. Always later. I turned the page and continued recalling even the smallest sneers, the quick glance of Colette's eyes, the twitch at Etienne's mouth. These were not mere slights. They were entries in a ledger, and I knew ledgers could always be balanced. When the last word was written, I set down the pen and stared at the page. The ink looked sharp under the lamp's light, like scars etched into the paper. My hand stilled, but my mind moved on. In Paris, I had learned that the most powerful response was not raised voices or broken glass. It was patience, calculation, and timing. I closed the notebook gently and placed it on top of the desk where I could see it. The act of writing had steadied me. My humiliation no longer felt raw. It had been transformed into record, into evidence, into something I could hold. I poured myself a glass of water, sat back, and let the stillness deepen. The old habit of silence, once heavy, now felt like strategy. They thought I had nothing left but the role of a quiet, aging mother-in-law. They were wrong. I had not lost what Paris had taught me. I had only tucked it away. The maple tree outside rustled faintly in the night breeze. Its branches reached across the window pane, as if to remind me that growth could be slow, unseen, but relentless. I returned to the notebook once more before bed, wrote a single line at the bottom of the page. Balance will come. Then I closed it with care. By morning, I knew exactly whom I would call. The morning sun broke across my desk, casting a pale rectangle over the notebook where I had written each insult. I read the words again, not to reopen the wound, but to remind myself that this was no fevered dream. It had happened. And because it had, I needed to decide what to do with it. For years I had let slights pass. I had let myself be reduced to the role of aging mother, grateful for a seat at the edge of the table. But Friday night had stirred something that had slept too long. The page before me was not just a record. It was a beginning. I reached for the phone and scrolled to a number I had not dialed in years. Martin Duval. We had met in Paris when I was still learning how to hold my ground in rooms full of men twice my age. He had been young too, then a junior analyst with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue. We had sparred once over a translation error in a contract, and instead of ending our acquaintance, it began a friendship. We had stayed in touch for a while after I returned to the States, but time and distance do their work. The last I heard, Martin had carved a name for himself in finance, moving deals like a man rearranging chess pieces. The line clicked. Sylvie Heron, he said, his accent still rich with Bordeaux. Dieu, it has been decades. To what do I owe this pleasure? I smiled despite myself. I won't pretend this is a social call. I need information, quietly. You always did. I could hear him shifting the sound of papers rustling. Tell me what's on your mind. The Morel Vineyard. Provence. Do you know it? A low whistle. Of course. Medium-sized family-run charming on the surface. But beneath it, I see why you ask. They are not as solid as they pretend. I leaned forward, gripping the edge of the desk. Tell me. He did with the precision of a man who dealt in facts like currency. The Morels had taken a bridge loan from a California distributor last spring. The note was convertible to equity if covenants weren't met. The whisper among investors was that the vineyard had overextended expansion, new bottling equipment compliance with American import standards. Ambitious and underfunded. Are they in trouble? I asked. Trouble. Martin chuckled. Not yet, but very soon. A capital call is due within weeks. If they cannot meet it, and I doubt they can, the note converts. Ownership shifts. Whoever holds the paper controls the vineyard. A pause stretched between us, long enough for me to hear the beating of my own heart. And this note, I asked, is it available? Everything is available, ma chère. The distributor is nervous. He would sell just to breathe easier. With the right shell, the right hands, the vineyard could belong to you, belong to me. The words lit through me like a spark on dry tinder. For a moment, I saw again the candlelit dining room where Colette had murmured, Elle n'appartient pas ici. She doesn't belong here. I thought of the smile curling at Sabine's lips, and I felt the weight of the notebook on my desk, each insult waiting to be balanced. Can you arrange it? I asked. Martin didn't hesitate. Of course. I will need a name for the entity. Something clean American with no ties to you. I looked out the window at the maple tree, its branches steady against the sky. Cascade Ridge Holdings, I said. Set it up in Wyoming. Use a registered agent. Nothing must lead back to me until I decide. Martin gave a satisfied hum. The Sylvie I remember. calculated, calm, dangerous when cornered. I'll prepare the documents. We ended the call and I sat still for a long time, the phone heavy in my hand. They had laughed, thinking me powerless, irrelevant, invisible. But invisibility is a powerful cloak if you know when to remove it. I pulled the notebook closer and turned to a fresh page. At the top, I wrote 2 words, Cascade Ridge. Below, in neat script, I added another, balance. By the time I put the pen down, I knew that silence had served its purpose. The next move would not be silence at all. The following week moved with a strange rhythm, like the quiet before a storm. Martin's messages arrived each morning, precise instructions, documents, to sign, accounts to open. I moved through them deliberately, each signature another step away from the woman they thought they knew. Cascade Ridge Holdings was born on paper in Cheyenne, Wyoming. A name without history. A shell designed to carry weight without leaving a trace. I wired the first funds through an account set up in Portland, my hand steady as I authorized the transfer. For years, I had signed only birthday cards, checks for utilities, the occasional donation to the library. Now I was signing for something much larger, and the ink felt different. Martin called once everything was filed. "The entity is clean," he said. "No one will connect it to you. Now, about appearances, would you like to remain invisible or would you prefer a mask?" "A mask," I answered without hesitation. "Invisibility has its uses, but a mask has power." "Then you will need a name," he said. I thought of my years in Paris, the young woman who had once spoken boardroom French without flinching. She was gone, but her shadow remained. "Marie Laurent," I said finally. "It sounds ordinary enough, but it's mine." Martin's chuckle warmed the line. "Marie Laurent, partner at Cascade Ridge. I'll begin drafting correspondence under that name." After the call, I sat at my desk and wrote the name on a blank sheet of paper. Marie Laurent. The letters looked sharp, decisive. A woman who would not be overlooked, who would not be dismissed. I tried the sound of it aloud, my voice steady in the empty room. Marie Laurent was not a widow waiting for her son's attention, or a mother tolerated at the table. She was a figure who signed contracts, who wrote letters on heavy stationery, who could sit across from Etienne and Colette Morel and not flinch. With each repetition, the mask settled more firmly, not to hide me, but to reveal the part I had kept buried. Sylvie Heron could be underestimated. Marie Laurent could not. That evening I opened my notebook and added a new heading beneath the insults, the mask. Under it, I listed the steps ahead, acquire the note, secure, the minority shares, prepare for the capital call. Each line was written in both French and English, as if to remind myself that power, like language, can exist in more than one tongue. The house was quiet around me, the maple tree outside swaying in the autumn wind. For the first time in many years, I did not feel small inside my own skin. I felt measured, deliberate, dangerous, if provoked. I closed the notebook and rested my hand on the cover. The woman they mocked on Friday evening would never lift her voice at their table. But the woman I was becoming would not need to. By the time I extinguished the lamp, Cascade Ridge Holdings existed. Marie Laurent existed, and so did the plan. The next step was already clear: acquire the leverage before they even knew it had slipped from their hands. The first document arrived before sunrise time zones, bending the morning toward me. Martin's email was clipped and clean draft assignment of the California note supporting schedules instructions for the transfer agent. I printed everything and laid the pages on the dining table the way I used to lay out birthday party favors for Adrian, carefully, in order so nothing would be forgotten. The note was the hinge. If it became mine, the vineyard's breathing would depend on my patience. I read each clause with a patience that came back like muscle memory. Default triggers, conversion mechanics, voting thresholds the original parties had thrown in as afterthoughts. Afterthoughts often decide a future. By mid-morning, Cascade Ridge's signature sat where the distributor's name had been expected to appear. The counterparty's counsel sent a brisk reply, funds received assignment effective on wire settlement. The first piece clicked into place with the quiet satisfaction of a drawer shutting flush. Minority shares came next, a different rhythm. 2 small French holders, an uncle by marriage, and a retired operations manager had fancied themselves patrons when they wrote early checks. Now they wanted out more than they wanted pride. Martin called from a car somewhere between the 8th arrondissement and La Défense, rain pattering his windshield. "They will sign," he said. A premium now feels like salvation to men who have promised more than they can afford. I drafted letters as Marie Laurent, formal, spare the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The stationery, heavy and watermarked, existed only as a PDF, yet I could feel its weight through the screen. We kept the offers polite but expiring. Politeness is more persuasive when married to a clock. One signed within hours, relieved to be done. The other held out long enough to pretend he hadn't been waiting for a door to open, then stepped through with gratitude dressed as reluctance. While documents shuttled across oceans, my days shrank to measured acts. I authorized wires, confirmed receipt codes, scheduled a remote notary who apologized for the time difference, and then apologized again when her dog barked in the background. I smiled and told her it was fine. Life was always louder than paperwork. She said she liked my name. I told her names are tools. The right one fits the hand. At night, I returned to the ledger notebook and added new lines. Not insults this time, but counters. Note acquired. First minority transfer recorded. Second transfer pending. I wrote them in French and in English, the way I had promised myself I would, watching the balance bend toward me with each stroke of ink. The quiet around me felt less like absence and more like concentration. Then came the capital call, formal notice, optimistic language, laid over anxious numbers. The Morels planned an expansion, additional tanks, upgraded, bottling American compliance upgrades glossed as positioning for growth. I read the budget twice and wondered whether anyone at their table had asked how to sustain what they wanted to build. It hardly mattered now. The call gave me the lever. If I funded my pro rata and theirs, the conversion mechanics would do the rest. Paper would finish the sentence I had begun with patience. Martin called again. "We can meet the call entirely from Cascade Ridge," he said. "The others will likely decline. Their cash is thin and their pride thicker." He paused. "You will be majority on recording. 51.8 by my math. They will round it down in their minds until the first vote forces them to round it up." I stood at the window while he spoke, the maple outside turning edges of its leaves toward rust. People imagine power announces itself with fanfare. In my experience, it arrives in certified emails and recorded filings in signatures neatly spaced on a page. I authorized the wire and watched the confirmation blink, a small green check that felt like the soft click of a door locking from my side. The distributor's receipt came with almost embarrassing gratitude. The minority holders sent notes that tried to keep dignity afloat. Martin forwarded a revised cap table, the numbers aligned in calm columns. There it was, Cascade Ridge Holdings, 51.8%. I traced the digits with my fingertip, not to gloat, but to confirm that the world now matched what I knew to be true. I did not tell Adrian. I did not tell anyone. I returned to my rituals so thoroughly that even I might have believed nothing had changed if not for the papers stacked in my desk and the steadiness in my breath. I cleaned the sink, folded towels, wrote a check to the food bank. Power handled correctly should not scorch a home. It should make a room feel level again. A week later, Etienne posted a photo online of a sunset over rows of vines, the caption in French praising endurance. I read it and thought of knees pressed into earth, of hands on pruning shears that pinch after hours. Endurance indeed. He did not know whose patience he had borrowed. The formal confirmations arrived in a single afternoon assignments, recorded transfers lodged with council capital, call, satisfied conversion, effective, on filing. Martin messaged only 3 words in every way. I closed my eyes and allowed myself one deep breath, then opened the ledger and added one more line, balance initiated. Evening slid in and the house dimmed into the kind of quiet that holds rather than hollows. I cooked a simple dinner, tasted it absent-mindedly, and imagined the next move. Silence had carried me this far. Now it would be presentation, a mask, a table, and a single envelope set down in the right light. My phone buzzed on the counter. A text from Sabine, bright with performative warmth. Brunch on Sunday. Just us. I found a place you'll like. I typed. Of course, and set the phone face down, already feeling my smile settle into something steady enough to carry me through. The cafe Sabine chose had walls painted in pale yellow sunlight pouring through the wide windows as if the world itself conspired to make the morning look gentle. She greeted me at the door with a kiss on both cheeks, her perfume sharp enough to sting. "Over here, Sylvie," she said brightly, guiding me to a corner table where the cutlery gleamed like jewelry. "They do the most divine croissants, almost like home. Home." She meant France, of course, not Oregon. I nodded, placing my napkin on my lap, steadying my breath. Adrian was not with us. She explained that he had been called into a Saturday meeting. I suspected otherwise. These one-on-one brunches were her stage, and my absence of allies suited her. We ordered coffee and pastries. The server brought them quickly, foam-perfect plates artfully arranged. Sabine leaned forward, her smile widening as though she couldn't contain her delight. "I must tell you," she began, voice dropping conspiratorially. "My parents adored dinner last week. They said it was so charming that you made the effort." I inclined my head. "I'm glad." She stirred her coffee slowly, spoon clinking against porcelain. "Of course they did notice how provincial your style is. Mama said she thought it was almost quaint. Papa said you looked as though you had dressed for church rather than for dinner." Her laughter was soft but deliberate. She waited, expecting me to flinch, to defend, to protest. Instead, I smiled. How generous of them to notice. Her eyes narrowed briefly before she recovered, smoothing the smirk back across her lips. "They didn't mean it cruelly, Sylvie. It's simply French standards, you know. Appearances matter, and Adrian, he deserves a family that shines." I sipped my coffee, letting the warmth settle in my chest. She spoke as though she was gilding herself in their approval, layering their words onto her shoulders like a mantle. She had no idea that while she paraded their condescension, I held in my desk drawer the papers that made me their majority partner. I nodded again, calm. "Adrian has always shone in my eyes." Her smirk twitched at the edge, a flicker so quick most people would miss it. She pressed on. "It must be difficult for you being around people with such refinement. But don't worry. They know you're doing your best. And I'm sure in time they'll learn to overlook the little things." I broke my croissant, its layers flaking neatly onto the plate. "It must be comforting," I said lightly, "to know they can overlook what matters least." Her laughter stuttered, then she lifted her cup to mask it. "Yes, of course. That's exactly it." I let the silence linger, letting her fill it with her own noise. She went on about their plans for expansion, how the vineyard was preparing to enter the American market in earnest. How exciting it was to be tied to such legacy. She spoke of capital and compliance as if she understood them, as if repeating her father's phrases made them her own. I listened smiling, as though each word were a harmless anecdote. In truth, I was memorizing every phrase, every assumption the way I used to in Paris when men underestimated my fluency. The pastries disappeared, the coffee cooled, and still her smile lingered, rehearsed and gleaming. She thought she had won something in those moments that she had pressed me into quiet acceptance. I paid the check before she could reach for it. "A lovely morning, Sabine. Thank you for inviting me." Her eyes widened just slightly at the gesture. She liked to be the magnanimous one. As I stood to leave, I gave her a smile as steady as glass. She would not know until much later how fragile her own had been all along. That afternoon back home, I opened the notebook and slid an envelope into its pages. The documents were ready now, waiting only for the right table and the right silence to be set down. The courier arrived just before noon, a slim package tucked beneath his arm. He asked me to sign, and I did, my name flowing across the pad with a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. Once the door closed behind him, I carried the envelope to the desk and slid it open with the same care I once used to open exam results, knowing the contents would alter something permanent. Inside were the last signatures. The second minority holder had relented as Martin predicted he would, and now every line of ownership pointed where I had intended it to point. The vineyard, with all its pride and pedigree, now belonged quietly legally to Cascade Ridge Holdings. To me. I spread the pages across the desk, pressing the creases flat with my palms. The numbers stood calm and exact, 51.8%. Not a boast, not a threat. Simply fact. I read each line in French, then again in English, savoring the symmetry of the languages. It felt almost ceremonial, as though by repeating the words, I was binding them tighter to reality. The house was silent, except for the faint tick of the clock. I gathered the pages together, slipped them into a cream envelope I had set aside for this moment, and sealed it. The act was ordinary paper glue, a firm press of the hand, yet it carried a weight far heavier than the sum of its parts. I wrote a single word on the front balance. The ink glided smooth and unhurried, my handwriting steady. I set the envelope in the center of the desk, not hidden, but waiting like a card face down in a game no one else knew they were playing. Later, I brewed tea and sat at the kitchen table, watching the steam curl upward. I thought of Sabine's bright smile at brunch, of her parents' dismissive glances, of Adrian's oblivious pride. None of them could imagine that the next time we sat at a table together, the ground beneath their feet would have shifted. They would still believe themselves hosts, still imagine they held the power. But I had lived long enough to understand that power rarely announces itself with noise. It arrives in silence, in paper stacked neatly in a cream envelope, in a woman who knows when to speak and when to wait. I finished the tea, washed the cup, and returned to the desk. The envelope remained where I had left it, pale and unassuming, carrying within it the correction to every slight written in my ledger. The phone buzzed on the counter, another message from Sabine this time, about a dinner her parents were planning with an important investor. She added a line about how it might be better if I skipped this one, not to upset the tone. I smiled, slow and quiet, and rested my hand on the envelope. The papers were ready. The mask of Marie Laurent was ready. All that remained was to place them on the right table at the right time. The call came the next evening. Sabine's number lit the screen, and before I answered, I already knew the tone she would use. "Bonsoir, Sylvie," she began, syrup wrapped around steel. "I wanted to speak with you about next week. My parents are hosting a very formal dinner. Quite a serious affair, really. An American investor will be present, and the atmosphere needs to be precise. We thought perhaps it would be better if you didn't attend this one." I let the silence stretch long enough for her confidence to waver. "Then I said Adrian knows about this dinner." She hesitated only a breath, but enough. "He does, of course. He agrees it might be delicate. Investors can be particular, you understand." Her words circled like perfume, sweet enough to disguise the sting. I closed my eyes and pictured the cream envelope on my desk, sealed and waiting. "Sabine," I said softly, "I appreciate your concern, but I will be there. The pause that followed told me she had not expected that. "It's not that we don't value you," she rushed. "It's just that first impressions matter." "My parents feel I will be there," I repeated. My tone was calm, not raised but firm enough that even she could not pretend to mishear. There was a sharp intake of breath before she covered it with a brittle laugh. "Of course, if you insist. We only wanted to avoid awkwardness." When the call ended, I felt the familiar thrum of my heart, not with fear, but with the anticipation of a woman no longer willing to ask permission. Later that night, Adrian called. His voice was careful, like a man trying to balance on ice. "Mom," he said about the dinner next week. "Maybe it would be simpler if you sat this one out. Investors can be particular." "I know what she told you," I said. "And I know why. But I am coming, Adrian." He was silent for a beat too long. "It's not about excluding you. It's just Sabine always thinks I cut in gently. And you always follow. But I am not asking this time. I am telling you." I heard him exhale long and weary. "Why does it matter so much?" I almost told him then about Cascade Ridge, about Marie Laurent, about the envelope heavy with numbers that would silence every smirk. But it wasn't time yet. He had to walk into that room, believing I was simply his mother, the woman they called provincial, the woman they thought powerless. Only then would he see the truth clearly. "It matters because family dinners are not hers to ration," I said at last. "And because I belong at your table, Adrian. Always." Something in my voice must have landed because he didn't argue further. He only said quietly, "All right, Mom. I'll see you there." When the line clicked dead, I sat for a long time at the kitchen table, staring at the dark window. My reflection looked back at me, older lined but steady. I thought of Sabine's confident smile at brunch, the way she had wielded her parents' disdain as if it were a weapon. Soon she would learn that weapons can be turned. I rose, walked to the desk, and lifted the cream envelope once more. My fingers traced the edge of the seal. The papers inside were silent, but they carried a gravity that no performance of refinement could counter. By the time I placed the envelope back on the desk, I knew the stage was set. The room they thought they controlled would not be theirs much longer. The restaurant had been chosen with care. A private dining room, heavy curtains shielding us from the clatter of the main floor, and a long mahogany table set beneath a low chandelier. The air smelled faintly of wine cork and polished wood. I arrived early, taking my seat at the far end where I could see the door. A glass of Burgundy had been poured but remained untouched at my place. The envelope rested in my bag. It wasn't heavy, but I felt its weight all the same. I laid my hands flat on the linen, steady my breathing even. The door opened just after 7:30. Etienne entered first. Tall, silver hair, perfectly combed, Colette beside him, her jewelry whispering expense. Sabine followed, her smile already in place, sharp and rehearsed. Adrian came last, his tie slightly askew, eyes searching for me. When they saw me sitting there, they paused at the threshold. Colette's eyes narrowed, then smoothed. Etienne's chin lifted polite surprise. Sabine blinked once, her smile faltering, before she adjusted it back into place. "Good evening," I said, rising slowly. "Please come in." They exchanged quick glances but crossed the room, Sabine leading. "Sylvie," she said, her tone light. "There must be some confusion. This dinner is very formal, you see." "No confusion," I interrupted gently. "I am exactly where I am meant to be." Chairs scraped as they sat a little stiffly, but still performing civility. Adrian's eyes darted between us, his unease clear. Etienne folded his hands. "We were told we would be meeting an American investor tonight, a potential partner of significance." "Yes," I said, slipping the envelope from my bag and resting it lightly on the table. "You are." I let the silence hang, then switched into French, my voice steady, fluid, as if decades had not passed since I last used it in public. "Permettez-moi de me présenter. Je suis Marie-Laurent, associée principale de Cascade Ridge Holdings, et propriétaire majoritaire de votre domaine. The words landed like a stone, dropped in still water. Etienne's lips parted, but no sound came. Colette's knuckles whitened around her glass. Sabine's smile cracked, faltered, then collapsed entirely. Adrien stared at me stunned, as though hearing a stranger's voice in his mother's throat. I continued still in French. You thought I could not understand you. That was your first mistake. Your second was believing silence meant weakness. I assure you, it does not. I slid the envelope forward, the cream paper stark against the dark wood. Etienne reached for it with slow, careful fingers, as though the contents might burn. He unfolded the document, scanning quickly, his expression shifting from confusion to dawning horror. 51.8%, he whispered. Colette leaned closer, her breath catching. Sabine tried to laugh a brittle sound. This is absurd. Some trick. My parents. It is no trick, I said in English now, voice calm. Cascade Ridge. Holdings holds the debt, satisfied the capital call, and acquired the minority shares. Every line recorded, every signature notarized. On paper in daylight and with memory. Adrien cleared his throat. Mom, what does this mean? It means I answered. Keeping my eyes on Sabine that the vineyard you so proudly speak of is no longer theirs to control, and it means the words spoken in French at your table last week have found their balance. Sabine's face flushed crimson. You humiliated yourself, not us. Pretending I leaned forward, slightly lowering my tone. Sabine, the performance is over. You paraded their scorn as if it were a crown. Now you will live under the weight of what you dismissed. Every laugh, every smirk, it ends tonight. The room fell into silence. The only sound was the clink of Etienne, setting the papers back down, his hand trembling. Adrien looked at me with something between awe and disbelief. You speak French, he said quietly, as though only now beginning to piece together the life I had kept hidden. I gave him a small nod. I always have. For a long time, no one moved. Colette stared at the chandelier as though searching for some alternate reality above her. Etienne pressed his lips together, calculating furiously, but numbers do not bend for pride. Sabine sat frozen, the confident smile that had carried her so far stripped away. Finally, I lifted my glass of wine, tasted it and set it back down. Tonight we eat, I said simply. Tomorrow we work. Decide who you want to be by morning. The plates arrived, then carried by servers who sensed nothing of the storm in the room. Crystal chimed faintly as they set down the dishes. None of us moved to touch the food. I looked at Adrien once more, his expression caught between questions and revelations. He would need time to understand, to reconcile the mother he thought he knew with the woman who had just altered the shape of his in-laws' empire. The silence that pressed in on the table was not defeat, but recognition, the moment when laughter dies and truth takes its seat. I folded the envelope back into my bag, certain it would not be needed again. The numbers were enough. By the time the plates cooled, I knew the next conversation would not be about family pleasantries, but about consequences. I had not planned to bring the envelope out again, but the air around the table demanded it. The servers had cleared the untouched plates, leaving us with nothing but glasses and silence. Pride alone could not fill a room this heavy. I reached into my bag, laid the cream envelope flat on the linen, and slid it across the table toward Etienne. His hand hovered for a moment before he drew it toward himself, opening it as though it might bite. Inside were the papers Martin had prepared, the fresh cap table stamped and signed its columns, precise and indifferent. Etienne's lips moved as he read, but no words came. The numbers spoke for themselves. Cascade Ridge Holdings, 52%. Colette leaned closer, her eyes scanning the page. Her bracelets jingled faintly as she clutched the stem of her glass. Sabine sat rigid, the color draining from her face as though each digit pulled it away. Adrian leaned forward, confusion etched across his brow. I let the silence stretch, then spoke in French, each syllable deliberate. Vous pensiez que je ne pouvais pas comprendre. C'était votre première erreur. The words landed heavier than the numbers. Adrian's eyes widened. His fork clattered softly against the plate. You've spoken French all this time. Yes, I said evenly, switching back to English so every word would land where it needed. I listened to every insult at that dinner table. I heard every word you thought I could not understand, and I chose not to answer then. But here is my answer now. I tapped the page gently with one finger. 52%. Majority control. Not opinion. Not pretense. Fact. Etienne shifted in his chair, his jaw tight, but he did not argue. Numbers had stripped him of rhetoric. Sabine found her voice brittle and strained. This isn't fair. You deceived us. I turned to her calmly. Fairness. Sabine is not decided by who laughs loudest at dinner. Fairness is decided by balance. You mocked me, thinking silence meant defeat. I let you believe it long enough for you to reveal yourselves. And now the balance has shifted. Adrian shook his head slowly, his hand still resting near the paper, as though it might vanish if he looked away. Mom, why didn't you ever tell me about the French, about Paris, about any of this? Because it wasn't the time, I said. You needed a mother, not a competitor. But when you married into a family that mistook cruelty for sophistication, you also needed to see that silence does not mean surrender. His face softened, bewildered still, but touched with something else. Recognition, perhaps, or the beginning of respect. Across from me, Colette finally spoke. This is not how business is done. Her voice trembled slightly, though she tried to wrap it in hauteur. It is exactly how business is done, I replied. On paper in daylight with signatures and records. The difference is, you are accustomed to winning with whispers. But whispers cannot alter math. Etienne folded the papers carefully, though his hand shook. He slid them back across the table to me, but the gesture was empty. He knew it. Everyone did. Sabine's smile had vanished entirely now. She stared at the tablecloth as though willing it to provide an escape. The cruelty she once wielded so easily had no place left to hide. I slipped the envelope back into my bag and smoothed the linen in front of me. The vineyard is not ruined, I said calmly. It has simply been corrected. You may remain part of it if you choose, but only by acknowledging what is now true. No one answered. Even Adrian stayed silent, though his gaze lingered on me, searching for the mother beneath the mask of Marie Laurent. I did not flinch under it. He would need time, but time is what truth allows. The waiter returned with fresh wine, placing glasses gently before us. I lifted mine not as a toast, but as a punctuation. The Morels lifted theirs mechanically. Sabine, only after a beat, Adrian last of all. We drank, and the silence that followed was no longer disbelief, but surrender. Numbers had done what words could not. I set my glass down and leaned back, the weight of the evening settling into certainty. The next step would not be about proof. It would be about consequence. Adrian followed me into the hall after the dinner, his steps uneven, his face pale under the low light. For a moment, he looked younger, not the husband with responsibilities or the man torn between families, but the boy who once stood in our kitchen, asking why people were cruel without reason. Mom, he began, his voice rough. What just happened in there? 52%. You speak French. All this time I met his eyes. All this time. And yes, I hold the majority now. He shook his head as though trying to dislodge water from his ears. Why didn't you tell me? Why hide it? Because it wasn't about hiding, I said softly. It was about waiting. There are truths that only matter when someone else reveals who they really are. His gaze flicked toward the dining room where Sabine lingered, speaking urgently to her parents. Sabine didn't mean those things he started, then faltered. Or maybe she did. I don't know anymore. She meant every word I said gently, and she laughed because she believed I couldn't hear her. That was the measure of her respect for me and for you. Adrian rubbed his temples, a gesture I had seen since childhood, when he couldn't reconcile what he wanted to believe with what he knew to be true. She says her parents pushed her, that she was just trying to fit their expectations, that she didn't mean to hurt anyone. Excuses, I said, not unkindly. Cruelty doesn't slip out by accident. It reveals itself when people feel safest. He let out a shaky breath. I defended her mom. I told myself you were imagining things, or too sensitive. And tonight I watched her freeze when you spoke their language. I've never seen her look so exposed. I touched his arm lightly. You wanted to believe the best of her. That's not weakness, it's love. But love that refuses truth becomes blindness. You saw it tonight. You heard it. He swallowed hard, eyes wet but unblinking. What do I do now? That's not my decision, I replied. It's yours. You must decide whether her explanations outweigh what you saw with your own eyes, what you heard with your own ears. From inside the dining room, Sabine's laughter rose brittle and forced a sound straining to hold its shape. Adrian turned toward it, then back to me. I don't know if I can believe her anymore, he whispered. I nodded, my voice steady. Then perhaps for the first time you are beginning to see clearly. He stood still a long moment, as if weighing the years behind him against the night's revelation. And in his silence, I knew something had cracked open inside him, something Sabine could not mend with smiles or excuses. When we stepped back into the room together, his face carried a new distance she would not fail to notice. The drive home was heavy with silence. Adrian kept his eyes on the road, his jaw set. Sabine sat in the back seat with me, her perfume sharp, her phone clenched in her hand, though she didn't touch it. The only sound was the steady sweep of the wipers against the windshield, clearing drizzle that felt like punctuation to a night already rewritten. When we pulled into their driveway, Sabine didn't wait. She followed me inside her heels, striking the hardwood like small declarations of war. You've made your point, she said as soon as the door closed. Congratulations. You embarrassed us and now you think you've won. But this isn't sustainable, Sylvie. You can't possibly want to involve yourself in business at your age. Sign the papers, sell your stake, and let us handle this. I set my bag on the chair by the door and unbuttoned my coat with deliberate calm. No, Sabine, I won't be selling. Her eyes flared. You're out of your depth. You'll ruin everything. My parents built that vineyard with their lives. You think you can just swoop in and dictate terms because of some technical majority? I faced her squarely, my voice steady. I don't think. I know. 52% is not a suggestion. It is control. And control, Sabine, belongs to the one who respects it, not the one who mocks it. Adrian stepped in, then his voice lower but more certain than I had heard all evening. Sabine, stop. She turned on him, disbelief sharp in her expression. Stop! She humiliated us in public, Adrian. She humiliated you. He shook his head. No. She revealed the truth. And the truth isn't humiliation, it's clarity. Sabine faltered, searching his face. You're defending her, against me, against your wife. Adrian's voice broke a little, but the words held. I'm defending what's right. I saw your face tonight, Sabine. You weren't shocked because you thought she was wrong. You were shocked because you knew she was right. Her lips parted, then closed, as though she couldn't find the script she always relied on. The silence that followed stretched long enough for the house to feel different, as though the walls themselves had shifted allegiance. I didn't press the moment further. I only stepped past her. laying my hand briefly on Adrian's shoulder. "This isn't about choosing between us," I said quietly. "It's about choosing truth over pretense." Sabine's breath hitched, but she didn't answer. Adrian's silence lingered heavy, but it no longer felt like indecision. It felt like something forming, fragile, but real. When I left the house that night, the rain had stopped, but the air still smelled of it. I knew that silence would not hold much longer. Something inside Adrian had cracked open, and Sabine would soon feel the full weight of what she could no longer spin. The next morning, Adrian called me. His voice was tired, as though he hadn't slept. "She's not letting it go, Mom. She wants me to force you out." I heard the weight behind his words, the old reflex, to appease, to smooth over, to choose silence where conflict lived. "And what do you want, Adrian?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. "Come by tonight," he said finally. "You should hear it yourself." When I arrived, the air in their house felt brittle, as though every surface had been scrubbed too hard. Sabine stood by the fireplace, arms crossed, her smile thin and sharpened to a blade. Adrian sat on the edge of the sofa, his hands clasped together, his body leaning forward as though he were bracing for impact. Sabine began, before I had even settled. "You need to understand something. Your mother has always resented me. She sees me as competition for your loyalty. That's why she's doing this. Why she ambushed us with her little performance. She wants to drive a wedge between us." Adrian looked up at her, his jaw tightening. "It wasn't a performance, Sabine. It was proof. Numbers don't lie." She stepped closer, her voice dropping into the softness she used when she wanted to sway him. "Numbers aren't family, Adrian. Love is. Your parents in France, this is your family. And your mother is trying to tear it apart because she can't stand not being the center of your life anymore." I said nothing, only watched the words fall heavy and desperate. Adrian rose from the sofa, slow but certain. "No, Sabine. You're the one tearing it apart. Last night I saw it. The way you looked at her when you thought she couldn't understand you, the way you laughed. That wasn't love, Sabine. That was contempt." Her face stiffened, but she recovered quickly, tilting her head in practiced disbelief. "You're overreacting. Everyone makes jokes in their own language, little private comments." "They weren't jokes," Adrian cut in sharper now. "You called her provincial. You told them she didn't belong. And you knew I'd believe you if you denied it, because I always have." Her mouth opened, but no words came out. "I've excused so much," he went on, his voice breaking. "The snide remarks, the constant corrections, the way you talk about her as if she's a burden. I told myself you were just stressed or that I was imagining it. But last night, I watched your smile vanish when she spoke French. You knew you'd been exposed. And for the first time, I couldn't protect you from the truth." Sabine turned toward me then, as though I had scripted his words. "This is your doing," she hissed. "You've poisoned him against me." I finally spoke calm and even. "No, Sabine. He simply heard what you never meant him to hear." Adrian looked at me, then back at her, his eyes wet but steady. "You wanted me to force her out. But you're the one making me choose Sabine. And for once I can see clearly who's destroying this family." Silence hung heavy. Sabine's lips trembled with words she couldn't form. Adrian sank back onto the sofa, his hands falling open, palms bare. His silence now wasn't avoidance. It was reckoning. And nothing she could spin would take that from him. I stood, knowing my place was no longer to shield him, but to let him stand in the truth he had finally claimed. The house was quieter the next week. Sabine stayed with her parents more often than not, leaving Adrian adrift in his own living room. He came to me one evening, his eyes heavy, his voice low. "I keep replaying it, Mom. The words they said, the way they laughed. I can't shake it." I poured him tea the same way I had when he was a boy fighting off fevers. Then, give those words less power, I said gently. Replace them with new ones. He frowned, confused. New ones, French ones, I answered. We sat at the kitchen table with 2 mugs steaming between us. I pulled out a pad of paper and wrote the first phrase in neat script, Je t'écoute. I slid it across to him. It means I am listening to you. Adrian traced the letters with his finger, then repeated it clumsily, his tongue catching on the sounds. Je t'écoute. I nodded. Better than you think. Try again. He did slower this time, and the rhythm softened. His brow furrowed in concentration, the same expression he had as a child, building model planes. I wrote another "Tu es important pour moi." He read it aloud, halting, then looked at me. What does it mean that you are important to me? Something flickered in his face, a mixture of recognition and ache. They used that language to make you small, he said quietly. Yes, I replied. But language doesn't belong to cruelty. It belongs to whoever chooses how to use it. Tonight, it belongs to us. We practiced simple sentences, greetings, affirmations, fragments that could build into something larger. He stumbled, often, laughed at his mistakes, but kept going. Each attempt felt like a brick laid carefully over a fracture, not erasing it, but making it strong enough to hold weight again. At one point, he looked up from the page, his eyes wet. All these years you carried this alone, and I never asked. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. You didn't need to ask. My silence was my choice. But now I want you to know, not because it will hurt you, but because it will connect us. He swallowed hard and nodded. Then he read the last phrase I had written, his voice steadier now. Je t'aime, maman. Tears blurred my vision, but I smiled. I love you too, Adrian. The kitchen was still, but it no longer felt empty. The words that had once been used to wound had become between us a bridge. And as I closed the notebook, I knew the next chapter would not be about revenge at all, but about rebuilding what cruelty had tried to take. Winter had turned to spring by the time I set the table again. Not in a polished dining room with chandeliers overhead, but in my modest kitchen where the maple tree brushed the window and the light fell soft across the worn wood. The plates were mismatched, the cutlery plain, but everything felt honest. Adrian arrived early, carrying a bottle of wine. He set it down with a small smile. Not Bordeaux, he said, but I thought we could start a new tradition. I poured us both a glass and we sat together while the food finished in the oven. There was no performance in his posture, now no tension in his jaw. He looked younger, lighter, as though something heavy had finally slid from his shoulders. We spoke about ordinary things, his work, the garden he wanted to plant, a book he was reading. No mention of capital calls or vineyards. No mention of Sabine's absence. Her name hung unspoken between us, but not as a wound, more like a scar that no longer dictated the shape of the day. When dinner was ready, we carried the dishes to the table and sat side by side. I watched him fill his plate, watched him breathe easily in a space that had once seemed too small for him. The first dinner, I said quietly, almost to myself, was insult. He looked at me, listening. This dinner, I continued, placing bread on his plate, is truth. Adrian's hand covered mine briefly, steady and warm. And this time, he said softly, I understand the language. We ate slowly, savoring more than just the food. Laughter returned unforced, rising from places it had been buried. For the first time in a long time, the table felt full, even in its simplicity. Later, as we cleared the dishes, I looked around the room. No gilded glasses, no French whispers behind folded napkins. Just a son and his mother speaking to each other in the plain language of dignity. I thought of the path that had carried us here. Silence mistaken for weakness. Cruelty mistaken for strength. Numbers mistaken for control. Each had been corrected in time, and in their place remained something quieter. Sturdier truth, acknowledged dignity, restored. Adrian lingered at the door when he left his smile soft. Next time, he said, "I'll cook." When the door closed behind him, I stood in the quiet kitchen, the plates drying in the rack, and felt no weight at all. Dignity, I realized, didn't need an audience. It needed only to return and take its seat.